Okay, well, welcome everyone to another episode 64 of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast, and the first podcast episode since I returned to God's country, aka Ireland. Today, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite topics, polygamy. We have a new guest on, Mark Tensmeyer. Mark comes from the great state of Texas, so we'll let him introduce himself in a moment. Just in terms of forthcoming episodes, hopefully sometime in December, we will have an Italian member of the church who has a background in theology and linguistics come on to discuss and critique the penal substitution model of atonement. And Blake Oster has agreed to come on sometime in the new year to discuss Aquinas' Five Ways, classical theism, as well as another episode in his 1987 article on the expansion theory of the Book of Mormon. And there's like some other episodes that we hope to have in the new year with Craig Foster and others as well. So keep an eye out for that. So with that being said, as I said, we are going to be discussing whether or not Joseph Smith was a polygamist. Spoiler alert, he was. But we have Mark Tensmeyer on. Some may actually know Mark because he did a two-part debate, a 2-on-2 debate with a good friend of mine, Jacob Vadrine, who's been on the podcast a couple of times as well, defending, yes, Joseph was a polygamist and he was not a monogamist. And we will be discussing his essay. Let me just pop up the Kindle edition I have here. Old Women's Tales versus the Historical Verification of Joseph Smith's Polygamy, in the book edited by Cheryl Bruno that came out by Signature Books this year, Secret Covenants, New Insights in Early Mormon Polygamy, which is actually a very good compilation of essays. My friend Don Bradley actually has 2 excellent essays on Fanny Alliger as well, trying to situate that, which is excellent. One was with Christopher Smith, and a series of other essays by Christopher Smith, Dinner, and others as well. So I know some may be put up by the fact that it's by Signature Books. I'm critical of some of their works as well, except for their document collections. But this overall is actually a very good book, and I would suggest if you're interested in Latter-day Saint history in general and polygamy specifically, you get a copy, either electronic or print, and a Amazon link is actually in the show notes. So, Mark, thanks for agreeing to come on. And maybe if we were to give like an introduction to your good self before we delve into this topic, like, what's your background? Have you always been a Latter-day Saint? What got you interested, like broadly Mormon studies and specifically Latter-day Saint history and so forth? So,
yeah. So I'm a lifelong member of the church. Have had my family's been in the church since the 1830s. Have some family lines that go all the way back there. And I've always been interested in the history of the church as well. It's the history of our people and my people. Um, it's a great thing to be a part of, and I've enjoyed that. I've always enjoyed learning about it. My grandparents were the did admission where they're the directors of the church's historical sites in Nauvoo when I was a kid, and I enjoyed going around there and seeing that. So I've always enjoyed it. What really got me into like the Mormon studies, like academic Mormon studies of history, it was about when I was graduating law school, and about when I was about to start my career, and then when my daughter was born, that I was just looking into it as a hobby I could do with my new lifestyle, with my new life demands. I had been into it before. I had enjoyed reading stuff. I mean, I had read a few books and things like that before, but it's really what I want to get into. What I really got into was was discussing historical narratives with people that came from other Latter-day Saint traditions. So a lot of who I was talking to at the time, this is 2014, so this was just as just before, just as like Denver Snuffer and all of that was starting up. But at the time, it was Community of Christ members. It was Restoration Branch people that are the RLDS traditionalists, people of that nature, and then fundamentalists and people of that too. And so that's when I got into, and that's really what learned how to, I really got into learning about this is how sources work. This is how you do research. This is how you weigh and balance different sources. And that's when I really learned a lot about how to do historical analysis, was doing that. And so that's pretty much led into this topic right here, whether or not Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. This was from that. Is just doing preliminary research into that.
yeah. And I'm sure like some will be wondering, why an essay or why a podcast episode or why an entire furore about was Joseph Smith a polygamist or a monogamist? Not to like detract or depreciate like your very fine work and so forth, and like the work of others like Brian Hales and Jacob Vidrine and others as well on this particular issue. But I'm sort of like just because this does seem to be like for the most part an online phenomena. So I
Yeah,
mean, hasn't this already been settled? I mean, like with the exception, say, the prices and some very small splinter groups of the or LDS now Community of Christ and the Elijah Message churches and a few other small groups. It's like Joseph Smith being a polygamist. That's generally accepted. The only debate is like whether Section 132 is a divine revelation, and
yeah.
so forth. I mean, why? And I know why, but like for those who may not be familiar with, like, say, the online debates and so forth, it's like, why a very lengthy and well researched article, or like, why isn't there even like an active debate? Like, didn't hasn't been settled already since the 70s or 80s when the or LDS
Well,
churches admitted Joseph was a polygamist?
that that is, that's a very, very legitimate question. Is this something that we should even be talking about? And for me, I got into it because I was having these discussions that weren't on an academic level. This was just with people, and at this time, this was in 2014, so this is before the new revival of this argument came up. I really said the new revival of the argument. Rock Waterman did a blog post on it in 2009, but then it didn't really start and become a thing until about 2015. That's when there was Denver Snuffer's speech on it, and then just before that, there was also the Joseph Smith monogamy paper that Leo Ebert wrote, and he was one of the opponents in the debate back there in Hemlock Knots. And so it was really just a very casual interest. I was just interested in the epistemology about it. I didn't really expect it to, but and so I got into it because yeah, because all this happened. But I mean, is it a settled question? I mean, the question is settled for who, right? Amongst the broad academic world, there is no question. There never has. There hasn't been. The the earliest the earliest scholars that took academic interest in Nauvoo period of Joseph Smith's life and in polygamy did address the question when they started it out. So Robert Bruce Flanders, he gives a pretty good discussion on it, and I think a lot of his reasons and things still hold up pretty well. And when he wrote Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi in 1965, he was an RLDS scholar. He wrote that. It's one of that's really the first serious academic study on the Nauvoo period of Joseph Smith's life. And Lawrence Foster, who wrote Religion and Sexuality, that when he's one of the first ones to do a serious um, a dive into Joseph Smith's polygamy and the origins of Mormon polygamy, and that was in 1981. In his book, he gives a really good discussion on it, which I quote from in the chapter. And so it's been discussed really around. So by the time guys when we had things like um like Craig Foster, we had any of the other ones, or we had things like Brian Hales or any of them come around, they'd already really considered it a settled question. And Richard Howard wrote a fantastic paper in the 1980s, uh, settling it for the RLDS Church at the time. And so you're right, it really was. So within the academic world, it's something that had been addressed and had been, but there's been a much larger revival of it. And so for the chap, and when Cheryl first Cheryl first approached me about it, I had written some things, I had talked about some things, and I really wondered if it really should even be something that we have an academic approach to. It's Brian Hales had written an earlier paper, I think in like 2016 or 2017, and he had submitted it to the Journal of Mormon History, and they didn't take it, not because they thought it was wrong or that it wasn't well written, but because
It was so obvious in their view.
yeah, yeah, right. They said it doesn't contribute to scholarship. I mean, I could write any paper on something that's already been talked about, and it doesn't contribute anything. So that's why a journal's not going to publish it.
Mhm.
Um, and so right, um, and so when Cheryl approached me about it, I thought she was like, it should even be for an academic journal. I mean, or for like a signature books thing. Is that because I was expecting just to just write something out and just put it out for just to like, I don't know, just put it out like on Google Docs or something like that. Just like not, but she said, but she's, and and I had to think about why really would this be? And I think, and there's a few reasons. One, because I do think that the idea that Joseph Smith not being a polygamist, that there is direct evidence, direct testimonial evidence that says that he wasn't. I mean, there are points, and there are definitely there's pieces of evidence, both direct and circumstantial, that would point to that being the case. I know, even though there have been scholars that have addressed it, there's various different depths that you can address that. And I also thought too, because there is a the there has been a big revival of it, and there are a lot of people that sincerely believe it. And that was one of the reasons why, in the first place, I really wanted to get into it, because it seemed like there were a lot of people that that would read some of this material and would look at it and go, "It sounds pretty convincing. I don't really like. I don't know that I really believe it or not, but I don't really know how to respond to it either." And so that's part of why I did it as well. I just on a personal level, I just really was just interested in the epistemology about it all. Just how the data works. It is an interesting subject about how you find out what's real, what's not. Finding historical questions. That's something that has always very much interested me, doing that. And so that's a big reason why I took it up. And another reason, it was just it didn't sound like anybody else, like very few people were doing it like quite like I was doing it. There's Jacob and Brian Hales, Jacob Padrine and Brian Hales, and others have done it too. But but it just, part of it was that a lot of people just really asked for it. Almost everything I've ever done on this, whether it was the debate, whether it was the paper, was because other people asked me to. And so I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it. There's times that I want to do it, and there's times I want to just stop me done and be like, I'm tired of it for now. I'll pick it up later. And it's funny. Jacob's the same way. Jacob Padrine's the same way about it, where he's just, I don't know how much of my life I want to commit to something that's already been proven, but there it is. But it's an ongoing movement that they have, and it's gonna be going on, I think, for the foreseeable future. So just wanted to put out there what I could about it, I guess.
Yeah, feel free to disagree, but like I think, like, say, the polygamy denier movement is similar to, say, the Flat Earth Society, in the sense, like, their arguments are atrocious, but they kind of show, like, say, the normal person in the street are pretty bad when it comes to, say, basic physics and so forth. They have a lot of assumptions, but they can't really prove them on the fly. It seems like there's a parallel when it comes to the polygamy deniers. It's like, Joseph was a polygamist, but like trying to answer some of the objections, you have to like dig a bit more, if you will. So
yeah. It's like, I'm sure I could probably go out. I wouldn't do this, of course, because that would be a terrible thing to do. But yeah, I could probably go out and convince maybe a half dozen people that the Holocaust didn't happen if I wanted to. But even then, I think a lot of World War II scholars and people like that wouldn't be able to answer the objections of Holocaust deniers, if they if they hadn't actually specifically studied their arguments. Well, and in like in religious studies and Christian studies, the big thing, there's the Jesus myth theory now that
again, large internet affair, but yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, and
Yep.
then but then right, the idea the idea that Jesus of Nazareth didn't exist, and that he's supposed to be, it was originally a mystical figure in early
Yeah, and he was
Christianity.
euhemerized, or like he was initially, like, there was a heavenly Jesus if you follow Richard Carrier, and everyone believed he wasn't earthly, but then he was transposed into the earth as a historical person.
Yeah,
That's one theory, and so forth.
yeah, and I mean, the majority of biblical scholars, whether they be believing Christians or not, I mean, they just kind of look at that as being something like, why are we even talking about that? But then again, unless they specifically address the ideas of mythicists, then they don't really know how to address them either.
Yeah. But there's
Yeah,
a
it's
reason
the
why
same
there's a
kind of thing.
convergence of belief, and it's not because like they're in the payroll of the
Yeah,
institution necessarily. It's like there's a reason why there's a convergence of belief amongst LDS and non-LDS, and even or LDS and other scholars and
yeah,
historians on Joseph being a polygamous, and it's not because we love polygamy. I mean, even Brian Hales and like his late wife, they did a lot of work on Joseph's polygamy, which is great. Even critics of their
Yeah,
positions would admit it. But it's like I know for a fact they both believed polygamy was, for lack of a better technical term, icky. you
yeah.
know, and I like
Oh
when
yeah, yeah.
and
Yeah, Laura especially would say, I
yeah.
mean, would be pretty candid about her feelings about that.
Oh yeah, pretty open about it.
And yeah, you'd have to be pretty close-minded not to be at least sympathetic to that or to
Sure.
understanding about that. Yeah, yeah, it is. And so, yeah, so, but yeah, you're right. I think it says as much about people as it does the topic itself, because there really is a people coming at it very, very different way. One of my biggest takeaways from this whole experience is just how even people that are in the same cultures can just look at reality so differently. I mean, you're right. I mean, there have been people that I've shown some of this material, whether it's some of the videos that are out there or some of the papers are out there, and I've shown it to people, and there are people that don't even know this topic very well, and they look at it and they go, "Wow, this is ridiculous. People take this seriously?" And it's not because they know the subject matter that well. It's because they know they can recognize the logic that the kind of logic that's being used in these things and in these things. And but then on the other hand, you do have people that are very intelligent people that look at that and say, yeah, for sure, or that will that'll read like my chapter or something and say, well, that was really thought out, but I don't see how it actually explains how Joseph Smith was a polygamist or really refutes the argument. So people see reality really very, very differently, and bridging that gap it's tough.
Yeah, it's similar to say the Rosa charts, where like say someone could see like a young woman or an elderly lady.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah, yeah,
one's hermeneutic or interpretive lens does color how they will view
yeah,
anything. So
yeah. And so one of the things I recommend almost as much as actually studying the subject matter itself is just to study the epistemology about it. I mean, I think something I think it's helpful to do is just like maybe set this aside for a little bit and then just like study the history of just something else. Like one of the things I've liked to use as a compare and contrast is uh the Continental Congress of the United States and the Declaration of Independence, because that's pretty well documented, and there's a variety of documents about those, whether it's the journals that were kept at the time, or there's Thomas Jefferson's recollections on it, or James Adams' recollections on that. So that's the Congress. I don't know how much you know about American history, being an Irishman, but I mean that's the
surprisingly quite a bit. It kind of shocks a lot of
yeah,
Americans.
yeah. I guess, yeah. People otherwise know a lot more about American history than Americans do of other countries' history. Yeah, um, yeah. But I mean, this is the Congress that was just meeting with the colonies during the revolution, before and during the Revolution, and stuff. And it's really interesting how to reconstruct the history of how the Declaration of Independence came about, and then just sorting out the different things. And it's you run into a lot of these very similar things that the issues that polygamy skeptics will look to and point to and say there's an anomaly there. And so you know, I really would point to study something like that. Look at something like that. How do you reconstruct something like that? Um, and so to be fair, um, it is an unusual subject, right? It is an unusual historical issue because it's an intentionally hidden history. It's something that the people who were involved with it, who otherwise are actually really good record keepers, are actually trying not to make any records of.
And whenever today they would use like say Masonic cipher or like weird abbreviations and stuff like that in some of the
Yeah,
records.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so because of that, in my course of doing all this, I've encountered people that will argue they don't believe Joseph Smith practiced baptism for the dead. Um, because they object to it on a theological or scriptural level, and
Yeah.
and you can make those arguments, you can make those theological and scriptural arguments for that, but whether or not as a historical thing, as Joseph Smith is not a he's not a he's not a like legendary figure. He's not like Romulus and Remus in Rome, where they say, well, maybe we should change the story a bit because that'll like better reflect our Roman history. You can see how ancient Romans would talk about that, how we ought to change the story. He's a person, like he's a historical person that that did things that did or didn't happen. And so you can object on a you can object on a theological level, but at the same time, to those people, there's things like you can point to things in the Times and Seasons that was published while he was alive. You can point to just contemporary contemporary reports of people going to Nauvoo and seeing it done from a variety of things. You can see reports from people that objected to it, that were believers, and what I'm saying is you can't really do that about plural marriage. And when I've discussed that with people, there's a different things because it is very different. The source material we have on the historical record on that is very different, and it's different than it would be for a lot of historical questions that you would address. And so it's a hidden history. I mean, things like this happen. It's another good point of comparison. I like the story of there's the Underground Railroad. The stories about all the about people that would assist escaped enslaved people from the South during the time of the Escape Slave Act and stuff before the Civil War. And that was something that people didn't write down or talk about at the time. And most of what we know about it comes from later recollections. At the time it's happening, it's an urban legend. But then most of what we learn about later is from later recollections and a
Yeah,
varying
and
variety.
of course, like historians don't doubt it did happen. They might just like
No, and
disagree
it
about
did
some of the
happen.
they might just disagree about like say some of the recollections or the accuracy, but there was
Yeah,
an underground railroad. Yeah.
yeah, but there was, and there are some privately held journals and things about people that were involved in it that did activities about it. There are people that were involved that they did write down, not very much though, and it happened much more extensively than what we have contemporary records for. But you're right. There's a lot of these things that are happening. So I looked at another one. I looked at there's a voodoo in Louisiana, yeah, pre-Civil War. That's something where almost everything we have about that's contemporary is really just this very racist material put out by the white-backed newspapers. You can read like you can read Marie Laveau's obituary that was published in a friendly newspaper, and it talks all about how she was a wonderful community person and a devout Catholic, and it doesn't say a word about her being involved in voodoo, being a voodoo priestess. uh, but then all those recollections we get those recollections really just in the beginning of the 20th century, really, of people of black people that were involved in it during all of that happening, but it's happening much later because that's when people are asking them to write it down. And so, between those, we can kind of get a better sense of what happened. That it's definitely not quite like all the contemporary newspapers put it out to be. And so, but I mean, there's still a lot of mystery involved there. But you can see that. I mean, there are times when this sort of thing happens. There's and that's one of the things that really got me interested in it is that it's a hidden history, and reconstructing that hidden history it's difficult to do. And there's a lot of open questions about Joseph Smith's polygamy, but the basics are things that we can pretty much know about. So yeah, there's that. So did you want to go into like what kinds of evidence do we have? I mean, that's one of the
Yeah,
that's one of
sure.
the big
Maybe
things.
just like
Yeah.
one or two things, and like we can use this as launching off pads. But one question some a friend of mine actually has, and you kind of touch upon say non-LDS historians like Lawrence Foster, who's written like say early Mormon and other communitarian groups and their polygamy and others. But what do you actually know what non-LDS historians who have a good grasp of like early LDS history actually think about this movement? Or do they just like dismiss it out of hand like so many other Latter-day Saints do?
Yeah. I mean, the idea that some would say that that Mormon studies is this very insulated bubble that doesn't keep the standards of other of the wider academic world. I mean, that is just categorically not true. I mean, I mentioned Lawrence Foster. He's never been a member of the church. And he's not antagonistic to the church at all. You should read the paper that he wrote about the Tanners. Um,
No, that's a classic. He even critiques the Tanners, so like he's not kind of cozy when it comes to say some critics, even if he's bit times critical of Joseph as well. So
oh yeah, yeah. He's yeah, he's yeah, yeah, yeah. He's there are a few that have handled it. So one of the an interesting one maybe that talks about it a bit. He's not one that's done polygamy directly, but but I guess he's up to. And there's John Turner who wrote the biography on Brigham Young.
And he also has a biography forthcoming on Joseph Smith as
On
well.
Joseph
So
Smith, yeah, that's right, that's right. And so he's never been a member of the church, and he's someone that has had extensive experience um, reporting on and studying religious topics before he ever got interested in Mormon studies. A really, really good resource that I don't think gets enough attention that should. There's Richard Owlett wrote his PhD thesis on the Temple Lot case, and it's a massive thing. It's about 1,000 pages long, but the first bit of it, it's about 300-400 pages long. It's just his history of the restoration up to the point of the Temple Lot case, and taking on taking special note of the items that would be of contention among among the different restoration traditions by the 1890s. And so anything about temple ordinances, about structure of the church, what the different offices, how that developed, and about the succession crisis. I think his analysis of the succession crisis, I think, is about the best I have ever read. And so I really recommend that. You can read that for free. That's Richard Owlett's dissertation on the if you just on the Temple Lot case. It's easy to find with Google. And he's never been a member of the church and or of any restoration church. And his handling of it, about all those topics, are about as even-handed as you could possibly get. Um, and he does a pretty good analysis on was Joseph Smith a polygamist. And he gets some good commentary on that. I would recommend that as well.
yeah, I just found it on Google, and I'll actually read it. It's the Mormon Temple Lot Case,
Yeah,
Space and Identity in a Divided New Religion. I in the chat I will actually share a link so you can actually download it as well. So thanks for making me aware of that. I was actually unaware of that, so I'll read it as
yeah,
well
it's very good.
soon.
I mean, its analysis on the Temple Lot case itself is pretty darn good as well. But it's extensive. But I mean, if you're not really into all of that, I mean, just his background on that. I mean, I think that's up there with, I think, as much as anything else that's been written there about the development of the restoration. That's I would easily, yeah, I'd easily put it up there to read if you're going to read things like Mike Quinn's Origins of Power, and just how how just the development of the church came, and how these offices came about. It's really, his analysis of that is really quite good, and I very much recommend it.
Cool.
So the idea that it's just that this is just an inherent bias that academics that have studied history have just not questioned, or they've just uncritically adopted, that is just categorically not true. That's
Yeah, and even ex-LDS critics, you're like more responsible historians like Dan Vogel and like D. Michael Quinn.
Yeah,
They as much as I disagree with them, especially Dan Vogel, when it comes to say the interpretation of say scriptural text, they were very good like documentary hounds, and Quinn did excellent work on post manifesto polygamy, for instance. I mean,
yeah,
for them it was basically a settled fact Joseph was a polygamist, and we actually do have a lot of conversions of evidence as well. So it's not really an open question. The open questions would be did Joseph engage in sexual polyandry? What
yeah,
about the
yeah.
nuances of
There are a
these?
lot of open
Yeah,
questions about those things. Yeah, but I mean, just the core issue is did Joseph Smith have did he have did they have ceremonies where people would be considered a man and a wife, that in some, at least in some cases, involved sexual relations, and was it something that he taught to other people? Did he issue a revelation on? And the answer to that is very much yes, he did.
yeah,
There's a lot of things about, was any given person you might be able to ask, but was this person a wife? Was this other person a wife? Maybe not. Or who was involved? Yeah, you're right. I mean, questions like which ones involved, which relationships were consummated, were they expected to be, what was he wanting to do? Yeah, we don't. I mean, there's open questions about that, and there's legitimate difference of opinions on that.
sure.
Yeah, but yeah, but it's interesting. So yeah, for a lot of people, it is quite obvious, and so from the vast majority of people, I would say, that look at this, it's really quite obvious that they really don't even need to. Really don't
But
even
this
need
kind of,
that.
but this kind of goes into like say the second thing, and then we can discuss like the evidence and epistemology. Like,
Yeah.
how much of it do you think is like a theological argument? And you do briefly touch upon in your essay, for instance, like for some, it's like polygamy is again, for lack of a better term, ick or disgusting.
Yes.
God would never sanction a true prophet to engage in polygamy because again, it's disgusting or icky. Ergo, Joseph,
Right.
who's a true
Well,
prophet,
I would say that that's something that I can understand where people are coming from, and it's not just necessarily a
or like
relation to
Joseph,
polygamy
or like
itself.
just on that, like a true prophet would never dissemble or lie. It seems like Joseph, if he did
Yeah,
engage
yeah.
in
A lot
polygamy,
of it
may
is
have
that.
lied.
Is it? A lot of it is that. Is it's not necessarily polygamy for a lot of people. It's not necessarily polygamy itself. It's but how it was in played that it seems so inconsistent with Joseph Smith's character, the way how it was done. Um, and whereas Brigham Young is a very polarizing figure. I mean, people. I mean, even among Latter Day Saints, he can be a very polarizing figure, and they can say it totally seems like something he would do. And so for a lot of people, it just it there's that as well, that it just and then also just scripturally, it seems so maybe incompatible with the Book of Mormon or what was published in the Doctrine and Covenants up to that date, that to do it in that way. So I mean, I don't want to be dismissive of that in terms of like I don't want to reduce that to insincerity. I don't want to reduce that to I don't want to just reduce that to people just not being able to emotionally handle that type of thing. Because I mean, there are a lot of issues with that, but you know, I wouldn't say that we should dismiss historical evidence because of that. I don't find that that's a reason to dismiss It probably be something either Joseph did or he didn't do. That's those are facts. Whether it's a scriptural thing, whether it's an ethical thing, how he did it, you know, even if it's not, what are those implications on him? I mean, those are all important discussions to have, but those are discussions you have after you determine what the facts are. And at least that's how I approach this. That's how I do. And but I would say that for a good majority of the people, at least just based anecdotally on my experience, it is primarily a theological issue. It is primarily that is primarily what is driving it. Um, Most people I've talked to, they do have they do have a spiritual conversion or revelatory version for it first, and then it's followed by maybe a factual thing that they have. And you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with doing it that. But if you're gonna present something as a factual argument, then you need to present factual evidence for it. And I say that in the paper too. I say that I don't that you know that it's you know for people to have like a faith-based reason for believing he was a polygamist. I mean, that's something we ought to be sensitive to, we ought to understand. I mean, there people believe all kinds of things based on faith. You and I believe things based on faith that other people look at and think are just ridiculous, and
Sure.
things that and you know there's things I believe in faith that I would not want to prove empirically, that I don't even would not even attempt to prove empirically. Not expect to prove empirically. But but then again, I'm not also presenting it as the fact that I believe those things purely on empiricism either. So yeah, that's that. Yeah, I think that's yeah. But then again, there are a number of people too that do believe, and I think I don't know that I have any real reason to disbelieve them, that are believing based on on an empirical level that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist. There are people that do. I wouldn't say that they're a majority, but you know, I believe that there are people that do just believe based on the facts, that don't have an issue with polygamy itself or how Joseph did it, but this just based on the facts don't believe that it is. So you know, I'd at least let people say that. I'd at least give people benefit of the doubt or believe them, take them at the word that they do. So
Yeah,
it's
I'm
not
kind of
purely
reminded.
theological, but I'd say it largely is.
Yeah, I'm kind of reminded, like, say, what Don Bradley said on the old Mormon dialogue board, like after the 3 volume series came out. It was like, Joseph was a polygamist. It would be so much easier for LDS if he wasn't, but he was, you know.
Yeah,
And I would agree with him. Like, I'm an LDS apologist. I happily wear that hat, you know, but not, you know, although I do consider myself a scholarly one as well. It's like, it would be so
yeah.
much easier. Brigham did not teach Adam God, or there was no priesthood restriction, but
Oh yeah.
they're the facts. And the same when it comes to polygamy. It's like, it would be so much easier, but they are, so deal with it, you know, and not
It
to
would.
be insensitive
You'd
to,
be
like,
so
say,
much.
difficulties. Yeah.
it'd be so much easier if it was the Paiutes that committed the Mountain Meadows massacre and not the Mormons. Like the
Yeah,
source. Well, for us at least, it'd be easier. I mean, I think it still would
yeah,
have happened and been awful for the people involved,
yeah, of
but
course.
that's
But
not what happened.
it's the historical facts, and like not to be like
It's
downplays like people's insensitivities, like problems when it comes to these issues. And I get it, I'm not insensitive,
yeah.
but when it comes to the history, it's like give me the facts. But no, I think that's kind of good. So like maybe we can discuss like say some of the evidences showed like yes he was a polygamist. It's not a later construction. Maybe like some notes about historical methodology as well. So
Yeah. So yeah,
is there like when it comes to say the evidence that he was a polygamist? Is there any particular topic or issue you would like to focus in on? Because I'm sure some
well,
will actually have some questions about the provenance about what is now Section 132. But if you have other issues
yeah.
you'd like to discuss,
There's
we
a
can.
lot. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about that, about the provenance of 132. There's a lot of the different ones, and there's been I've done interviews about that. It's the paper is what that's one of the things I wanted to do is to give a really good overview of what the sources are. I don't think that there's not anything, and I say this, I don't think there's any one thing that I think is like the evidence that it all rises and falls on.
It would be more of a convergence of various
Yeah,
strata.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it is. In the chapter, I break things down into four categories. I say there's contemporary, like printed, published contemporary sources from dissidents, people that had some sort of exposure, whether Joseph Smith taught them plural marriage, whether he proposed plural marriage, or they saw him the revelation, or they, that he's somehow involved in facilitating a plural marriage to somebody or attempting to. And so there's quite a lot of that. There's actually quite a lot between but starting in about April 1842 up until he died. There's really a lot of that. I said that the other category, there's privately kept evidence too. So this is like journals, letters, and there's not as much of that as you might first think. But given the secrecy of it, there's actually about as much as you could reasonably expect, and there's quite a bit of that. There is quite a bit of that of these privately held documents that people wrote down in their journals or letters at the time, and then of course there's all the later recollections during the Utah after the church has publicly acknowledged plural marriage, and then in the following decades when they've wanted to go back and document and look back at their history, there we have several we have lots of accounts there, people who firsthand accounts, there are people that did it. And and then the last category I had was just were all the third what I call the third party things. These are accounts from people who are not apostates, who are not dissenters, from people who are not polygam who some of them are not polygamists. None of these people are Utah Mormons. They're not people that accept Brigham Young's leadership. There's some
So
of
they
them
would
like
have no reason to be in on the conspiracy, if you will.
yeah, I no reason to support it. I mean, there's people like William Marks, Ebenezer Robinson. Um, yeah, and that's one of the things that's one of the things that when I really started getting into that, that's one of the first things I really looked for to find. And so it's really those the categories that I really wanted to focus on. So the category, so in the chapter, I did a chart of the contemporary evidence, and that's just and that included the private and the public stuff too. So I included that. That's part of the chart. Um, and that's something I did get. Jacob Adrien helped a lot with that. He found some of the things, brought some to my attention. Don
Yeah,
Bradley did.
just shout out to Jacob because, like, although we have theological differences, I think we'll be dialoguing about Adam God in the new year. So, like,
Yeah,
he's an excellent document hound, and he's really informed about the topics he
he
discusses.
he really is. He is. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's him and I haven't really don't really talk theology very much. Most when we talk about this, but yeah, he does. I mean, he knows this stuff very well. And he's very good about putting things together. And I mean, he's a good historian. He's a good amateur historian. Like, he knows his stuff pretty well. He knows how to weigh and balance sources and convert stuff very, very well. Um, yeah. And so, and as of course does Don Bradley. I mean, obviously.
Yeah, no, Don's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
one of the
And
loveliest
so
people you'll ever come across.
yeah, and documentary. So that was one of the things I put together, and I did try to come up with it as complete as I knew to the list of all these third party sources as well. And so, if nothing else, I thought that the paper at least accomplished that, where I have a good depository of all of those things.
Yeah, and everyone should check out the essay for like full details. We can only scratch the tip of the surface,
Yeah,
if you will.
yeah,
So this is more like an entree before you delve into the main meal, if you will. So maybe if we were to discuss, like, say, some of the topics you discussed, like, or some of the headings you put down, like, one of the most important things is would be like, say, what's called hostile witnesses to an event, like
yeah,
where you would not expect a person to affirm something unless, of course, it did happen. And sometimes
yeah,
you kind of mentioned, like, say, some hostile witnesses who became members of the then or LDS church, where like a tenet of their belief was like Joseph Smith was never a polygamist, polygamy bad, so forth. But they basically affirm, yeah, Joseph was a polygamist in
yeah,
varying degrees. You kind of mentioned William Marks, and
yeah. William
others. So
Marks
like,
is one.
do you want to discuss, like, say, some of the evidence from these so-called hostile witnesses, if you will, to like the Brighamites and or polygamy itself that kind of show, like, yeah, it was, even if they did not believe it was like from Revelation per se.
Okay. Yeah, William Marks is a really good one. So just some background on him. Uh, he's uh, he's the stake president of the Nauvoo stake at a time when that's the general authority level position. When a time when that reports directly to the first presidency, and and um, and by a lot of ways looking at it, he's equal in authority to the Quorum of the 12 by a lot of ways. And so um, not only that, he's also involved in all of these secret councils in the Nauvoo. So he's someone that he's part of the anointed quorum that gets his temple ordinances while Joseph is alive. He's part of the Council of 50. And he's also a very good friend to the Smiths. I mean, he's Emma Smith's very close friend. He's the one that Emma actually wants to be put in as the president of the church following Joseph Smith's death. And so, she wrote a letter to a school teacher. She said he's the one that should be the next president of the church. Should be William Marks. And William Marks, you're reading him. He's a all around. He's a pretty he's a guy that believes in following the rules and doing the right thing and just really in general good Christian conduct. He's a guy that you could very easily see being, a pastor of the church or any other church really today. Very very easily that way. But he's also really not on board with a lot of the Nauvoo innovations. But he doesn't speak out against them either. He participates. He doesn't think that they're. He would really rather. He really thinks of like the Kirtland era church as being the high point of the church. And he says that later. He says things like that the dedication of the Kirtland Temple was the high point of the early church, and he wants to get back to that. And so he's a guy. He supports Sidney Rigdon initially, uh, but um, but then after Sidney Rigdon's doesn't when the church sustains the Quorum of the 12, he says, "All right, well the church sustained the Quorum of the 12. I'll go with the Quorum of the 12." And he has a pretty tense relationship with them for a bit, and then until he's finally basically run out of town out of Nauvoo. And like a lot of people in that situation, he goes to various different restoration groups before ending up in the RLDS Church. And he's even a counselor in the first presidency to Joseph Smith III. So he is one of the RLD. He's the president of the RL. He's the first counselor in the first presidency of the RLDS Church. And and all along, no, he never does like I haven't seen any source that says that he's ever in any way involved with polygamy at all. At most, maybe he turned a blind eye to it with certain people. At most, that's what happened. And then but he does go on record. He says that Jacob. We mentioned Jacob, and Jacob has an excellent video that he's put on his thing where he goes over all of it, and he goes over all the sources about William Marks. I highly recommend it. That's
This is on Jacob's Defending Section 132 YouTube channel, by the way. Again, as much as I disagree with Jacob on certain theological issues, he's done excellent work on this and many other topics as well.
Yeah,
So
he tracked down every source about William Marks talking about polygamy at all, and does an excellent analysis on it. I recommend that. But a couple of them that he does, because William Marks is one that says that Joseph Smith came to him and says that he wants William Marks to get rid of polygamy, or he wants to get rid of polygamy. And when William Marks relates the story several times, and many times he leaves it ambiguous about whether or not Joseph admitted he was part of it. He leaves that ambiguous, and it depends on his audience. But there are other times he makes it very explicit that Joseph was involved, but then he said that Joseph regretted it, and that's a whole topic there. Did Joseph actually regret it? Was he actually wanting to get rid of it? Was he telling William Marks that? I don't know. Um, I mean, I talked about that in the chapter. There's been analysis on that from other places. But one of the big things is there's a couple of times where he says that the revelation that Hiram read to the High Council was about polygamy, was authorizing polygamy.
yeah, and that's significant because like usually people will say like Joseph did receive a revelation dealing in
Yeah,
some way with marriage, but it's not what he's section 132. It had nothing to do with polygamy, but there does seem to be like not only was there a revelation, it is substantially what we have in section 132.
yeah, and so that's the narrative for those that are for polygamy skeptics, the counter narrative that they're presenting, that's undergone a lot of evolution. The arguments that, and I laid them out in the paper, the arguments that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, those have been pretty much the same since the time of Joseph Smith III, really. But that's only half of it. That's the part. The other half is if he's not a polygamist, then where does Mormon polygamy come from, and why do so many people seem to think that it was him that started it? That's the part that's undergone a lot of evolution. And so just the position that Jeremy Hoop and Leo Everett took in the debate we did on Hemlock Knots. When was that? 3 years? That's about 3 years ago.
Thereabouts,
Not
yeah. I
quite.
remember like interviewing Jacob a few months after it took place. So
Yeah, yeah, and I saw that interview. Yeah, yeah, been doing that. Yeah, so it was about 3 years ago. They're arguing a very, very different position. They were arguing that Joseph was sealed to these women, but that it was a non-marital sealing. Um, as far as I can tell, they no longer follow that. Like the polygamy skeptics, at least the major ones, don't ascribe to that narrative anymore.
and some of the older ones, like the Prices, like in their three
Yeah,
volumes, Joseph Smith fought polygamy, is like it was basically like something that came from the Cochranites or some external
yeah, yeah,
movement
and
as
and, they,
well.
and yeah, yeah, and these things do merge. And well, I mean, it's like anything else. I mean, you do your work based on what people before you have done before. You look and see what work's been done before, and you do that. I mean, that's just what they're doing. But yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, Joseph Smith III was he, he you can read his things. He's not really sure what it is, and he's not consistent about it. But the thing that he's the most consistent about is when he says later, is he says that no, this polygamy happened after sealing, is polygamy, that all happened after his father died, not long after, but after. And that was really the narrative that the RLDS Church did for all along, really. Um, Up until really the 1980s, and that's when the Prices came out with theirs about how it's the Quorum of the 12 were rogue while Joseph Smith was alive, and um, and so yeah, they said that they picked it up from the Concordites in their mission there. This other group that's practicing a spiritual life form, they experiment with it in England, and then they're practicing it behind Joseph's back in Nauvoo, and that's where it comes from. Um, and by and large today, polygamy skeptics today still ascribe to that by and large. But the question is, so was Joseph doing anything that 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 polygamy is based on? So is anything about it, sealings, the revelation, is that all just something that's made up whole cloth, or was he doing anything about it? And they've differed on that. So that's what I was saying. Like when Jeremy and Leah were doing their bit in the during the debate, they were taking the position that yes, Joseph taught sealings and he was sealed to these women. possibly maybe he was sealed to men, maybe he wasn't, but that he was sealed to people. And so what polygamy is it's an opportunistic corruption of that doctrine. There's something that Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 took, and then they morphed it into that. And so since then, the current one that's the most prevalent is that Joseph was teaching monogamous sealings, monogamous marital sealings, and that sometimes involved a man being sealed to his deceased wife while still being legally married to his current wife. And so that there was a revelation that Hiram did read to the High Council that bore some resemblance to Doctrine and Covenants 132. But that the Corinth so that's the narrative that's out there right now.
Yeah, and how would he respond to someone like, because I know this is like an apologetic for the perspective, is like, and it's based at least on some truth, like Ugo Prego and others have done. Like Ugo Prego recently has done like a lot of genetic studies, and at least for those who have been tested and can be tested, we have shown that Joseph actually had no biological progeny. Adopted, yes, but not biological. So wouldn't actually hit like, yeah, it may be just like say Celines or like some kind of patriarchal thing, but like there was no full-fledged plural marriages simpliciter, if you will.
Well, yeah. So on the topic, that's an interesting topic. Where I'm working on that one right now. I'm doing some things. I'm hoping that we're going to get something out. Something else that somebody else approached me about wanting to work on. About maybe some empirical studies on that about why we don't have any children from Joseph's plural marriages, and there could be any number of reasons why. I mean, not all sexual encounters result in the birth of a verifiable child. We don't. Well, it's like I say in the paper. We don't know enough about the how much in practice any these things were actually consummated. How many of these relationships were consummated. The frequency of which he may have had relations with any of these women. We don't know that there's enough of them that we can just say that it would be too much of a statistical anomaly for there not to have been any children.
I would agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, like, if anything, it kind of shows like Joseph did not engage in polygamy because like he was this kind of sex pastor because of libido.
Yeah. I mean, that's
unless we're going to believe the absolute, frankly, the BS narratives, like say John Bennett being his personal abortionist or whatever, which I think is absurd. But yeah.
I mean, that's a whole rabbit hole you can go down to, a whole other topic we can talk about. But yeah, I agree. I think that there's something, but like I said, I think it would be a logical fallacy to say that the lack of any verifiable children is a means that he was not having any relations with any woman besides Emma.
Especially when there's the convergence of other evidence as well. And maybe we can discuss like one more as well, because this is, I mean, that's been critiqued as well. And that is like some of the contemporary evidence, namely like say the William Clayton journals. And by the way, like I know you know this, but like for those who do not know, a non-LDS publisher, probably Oxford, will be publishing the entirety, hopefully, of the William Clayton journals sometime next year. So
I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, same. It's been about time. But so like maybe if you were to give background, like say, what do we know about Joseph's plural marriage from William Clayton? And maybe like for those who may not know, like why is William Clayton so important? Like especially vis-a-vis his relationship with Joseph. And how do we know like these are contemporary accounts? They're not like later Brigham Young era forgeries, basically, which is like one strand of thought now.
Yeah, so the William Clayton journals, William Clayton, if you've read any of his journals, whether they're the ones that he has when he's still in England, or whether they're the ones that he has in Nauvoo, they are embarrassingly candid. Really, really just embarrassingly candid about himself and about everybody else too. He really, and he talks about almost everything. He talks in more detail about things like the Council of 50 or about the Anointed Quorum than anybody else does in their journals. And then he also talks about plural marriage, both his own and also Joseph Smith's. And so from him we get the most insight into that. And so he does talk quite a bit about Joseph Smith's plural marriages. There's quite a few. He mentioned, like for instance, he records him performing the ceremony for Joseph Smith and Lucy Walker. He talks about the Partridge sisters, Emily and Eliza Partridge, in connection with Joseph Smith and Florida Woodward, and then of course Joseph Smith facilitating Clayton's plural marriage, of Joseph Smith encouraging him to take plural wives, and then also him counseling with Joseph when things didn't go very well with plural marriage for him. And so there's quite a bit that we know from William Clayton. It's by far the most extensive narrative story that we have about Joseph Smith and plural marriage that's contemporary. And so you're asking, so how do we know that it's contemporary?
Yeah, because as you discuss in your essay, a certain person who I will not mention because he does not like being mentioned in any setting has been claiming like, well, at least one of the Clayton journals are like a forgery. It was produced during the time of Brigham Young, probably. And a few others have made that claim as well. I think Jeremy Hoop does as well. So how do we know,
Yeah,
like, say, the accounts of Joseph?
Jeremy Hoop does, and yeah, and yeah.
So how do we know that,
Um,
for instance, you mentioned the Kinderhook plates, and I think that's a rather interesting conversions, but
yeah.
maybe if you were to mention that and like some other evidence that like, yeah, these are authentic and contemporary.
Um, well, in the case of those two individuals, I don't think that they're necessarily saying that they weren't written at the time. They when I've listened, because they both did interviews on with Michelle Brady Stone, and they go through it they go through it pretty thoroughly. Both of them do, and especially Jeremy goes through it very thoroughly, and he really did do his homework about William Clayton and about both during the Nauvoo period and after. And so uh, the claim that they're making really is that William Clayton wasn't keeping this journal as a daily journal. That this is something that he was that these are that these that his journal, the Nauvoo journal, particularly the notebook two. Notebook two is this period that covers a period from 1843 to 1845, and it's one that covers all of this. That it's a very clean copy that that doesn't and it certainly is very clean copy compared to his other notebooks. And so that's evidence that he's not writing in this every day. He's not writing he's maybe writing this in batches, possibly based on copying from other notes that he has. That's an interesting thing. I mean, um, to some degree, to some degree at least, I'm sure that that's true. That especially these sermons that he has of Joseph's, that he's copying those based on something that he's kept in other pages. But um, but they're not necessarily saying that he's doing this after it's over, after Joseph Smith, even after Joseph Smith is dead. Jeremy even says that he says he's not sure when William Clayton did it, and it could very well have been while Joseph was still alive. Which has all other kinds of implications on the level of conspiracy that must have been going on for that narrative to work. And so, but how to I think we can get a better sense of this. A lot of the discussion we're having on this is pretty premature since the journals haven't been released. A lot of the observations those gentlemen made were made based on really about 20 or so pages of the Clayton journals that are on the Joseph Smith Papers website that are mostly of his sermons, his transcriptions of his sermons that probably are copied from other papers. And so, but there are things like you met the Kinderhook plates. Quite a few people have pointed that out. How there's a date, and it's either the day of or the day after that Clayton records the marriage to Lucy Walker, where Clayton outlined one of the Kinderhook plates. And the Kinderhook plates are those plates that were come to Nauvoo that were we've since found out are fraudulent, but that's not really the point of how that fits into here. But there are plates that are brought to Joseph Smith for him to translate, and Joseph Smith looks at him and stuff, and William Clayton makes a tracing of one, just tracing the outline in his journal, and then over a century later, that when those were discovered and those were looked at, Stanley Kimball compared it to the journal, and it was a perfect fit, and it has a hard edge on it. And so So we brought that up, that that would be something that would tend to show that it is something that he had, that he was making at the time in Nauvoo. And so especially with it having a hard edge on it. And is it possible that William Clayton, went through the experiment to get like maybe a woodcut or something of the journal, and then traced it into his journal to give added authenticity, so that a century later people like me would look at it and go, yeah, that proves it's authentic. Is it possible he did that? Sure. Is it within the realm of possibility? Sure. um,
But it does seem to
but
be quite a stretch.
but I mean it. But I mean, it's unlikely. It is something that definitely tends to make it more likely, and tends to make it more. And so, which really goes into goes to a deeper conversation we have maybe about how do we. I mean, to what degree can we not can we prove that something wasn't fake? Or at what point do we have to say do we have to go through this for something wasn't fake before we just say, look, it is what it appears to be?
Yeah.
I mean, I use the example in the chapter. There's the Anne Frank diary. I mean, the Anne Frank house, they've done everything possible. They have taken all of the arguments against its authenticity seriously, and have subjected it to all the different tests. And it hasn't quieted the naysayers. They've done that because there's always something you can do to say, well, he thought of this, or they thought of this. But that's the thing, is that the deeper and deeper you get into these things, the more and more extensive the conspiracy has to be. And at some point, you have to go. Uh, you have to go. That would just be too much effort to do too little. And really, when you look at the different kinds of it, that's one of the reasons I'd say most people, and I agree, but I think even people that haven't done a deep dive into this would say is one of the fatal flaws about polygamy skepticism, is it's like that Brigham Young and Company would have to do way, way, way too much to produce relatively little, when other things would be much simpler to do if that's what they wanted to do. That's where people would say that that's why people call this a conspiracy theory, is because it requires believing there's all these things, like William Clayton, finding the piece of the Kinderhook plate and then tracing it, and then just like leaving it there for people to find, like, a century later, doing little things like that.
Yeah.
um, and then all the different people that would have had to have been involved with it, that a diverse amount of people would have to be involved with it, and that have to be involved. I mean, well, one of the things people say is that either way you look at this, it's a conspiracy. That either it's a conspiracy that Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, they're running this behind people's back in Nauvoo, and they're not being open about it. They're actually actively drawing attention away, or they're actively shielding it. They're actively they're actively trying to conceal all this, and while at the same time they are recruiting people to be part of it. They said that's a conspiracy, and in a sense of the word, for sure, that is. You could say that is, but and so therefore it's a conspiracy either way. But when people say that, they say that as a means to say that either way, that either side, either narrative is as reasonable as the other, and that frankly is just not true. That the conspiracy narrative about Brigham Young doing this behind Joseph Smith's back is is far, far less reasonable, far, far less. And one thing I talked about, there's Occam's razors. You have to assume so many more hypothetical facts for Brigham Young to have been doing this behind Joseph Smith's back. Uh, um, that that it just doesn't work. And there's so many there's all kinds of problems with that. And I go through many of them. And one of them being that if there was, then it would have been virtually impossible for Brigham Young to have kept that from Joseph Smith. And all of that. That's one of the things I wanted to go through in the chapter pretty extensively, is like, what did people know about polygamy while it was happening? What did events, as these events were happening, how did these things that were meant to be kept secret, when did they come out in the open, and how did Joseph Smith respond to them? that's a level of evidence that I think is vitally important about that. And I go over that in the chapter. How did Joseph respond to these things as they came out? And what does that tell us?
But I think that's a good point, and maybe that kind of may lead into, like, say, in the last couple of minutes, we have, like, say, a discussion about historical methodology. But before we do, like, Michael Zitter kind of submitted a really nice super chat. It's like, he also says, like, no questions, just appreciation, and cause Mark is phenomenal, great guest to have on. So thanks for that.
Oh, thanks.
In terms of, like, historical methodology, just for those who are listening, an excellent book. It's only until recently I've only been able to find it on archive.org. It's a guide to the historical method by a Jesuit priest and scholar, Gilbert Garrihan, 1946, by Fordham. I managed to actually find a copy on eBay a few days ago, but I'll gonna share it on the chat because it's a very good, even if it came out a few decades ago, discussion about historical methodology. Maybe I might do a series on based on that book on, like, historical methodology for Patreons of the blog and YouTube channel. But be that as it may, like, there's, like, certain historical criteria like historians use, and then, of course, you know this, like, to determine where an event took place. Like you mentioned, the Clayton journals. Anyone who reads, even, like, say, the Clayton journals that are available, such as those that were published by Signature Books, is like, he's really, really canned about his own failings and the controversies in the church at his time. So much so, like, sometimes it's really cringe, like, say, how he absolutely crushes on, like, a wife, a future wife in England, and this is him.
Not a future wife, a girl, one that he later on wants to propose to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah. And also, like, say, the controversies about Orson Pratt, like, say, Adam and his debates with the Quorum of the 12 and Brigham, which would lead to, say, the Adam God controversies in 1860.
Yeah.
Like, he's really honest, where, like, if it's, like, edited or redacted or what have you, it's like, you would expect Brigham, like, for instance, like, it doesn't seem like he's aware, like, say, the controversy about the succession crisis, and he's not trying to read, like, say, some kind of pro-Brighamite propaganda, if you will, back into the narrative, which you would expect. So, like, while it is abuse, like, there's one of the criteria used in Jesus studies to know, like, if an event in the life of Christ happened. Like, one of them is, like, the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. This was embarrassing to early Christians because, as with Latter-day Saints and Catholics and others, early Christians believed you had to be baptized to receive a remission of sins and be born again and regenerated. So why is this sinless Son of God guy being baptized by his cousin? Right. And doesn't this show, like, John the Baptist is greater than Jesus? So, like, this is usually taken even by, say, John Dominic Crossan, and Bart Ehrman is, like, almost as much of a historical fact as, like, the crucifixion of Jesus, which was embarrassing as well in the Jewish culture. So, like, at least when it comes to, say, the criteria of embarrassment, and of course there's other historical criteria, this doesn't fit the bill. So, like, when it comes to, say, other historical criteria, like other methodology, how sound is the pro-polygamy or pro-Joseph was a polygamist, not a monogamous method side when it comes to, say, not that there's such thing as, like, when it comes to
one
this.
thing that it really, really, one of the big fatal flaws about this, we've mentioned it throughout this whole time, both you and I have, is where there's this convergence of evidence, where you have multiple points of evidence that can agree on a certain detail, so much that it doesn't seem like they could all just make the same mistake.
And especially with some of these actors would have been, they would have benefited otherwise, like members of the LDS Church and so forth.
Yeah. So people like William Marks, I mean, that's a criterion of embarrassment too. So, I mean, you have the expositor, which talks about the, which is Austin Coles, and then it's and William and Jane Law talk about the revelation that's about, and say it's about polygamy, and then you have William Marks, who confirms that that's what it was. It wasn't a revelation on monogamy, monogamous feelings. It was a revelation on plural marriage, and he's saying that privately in a meeting with the RLDS First Presidency and Quorum of the 12th. And he's not someone that's pro polygamy at all. I mean, it's something that is quite embarrassing for him to have to admit that.
So you also have, like, a hostile witness, not just embarrassment as well. And that's pretty important as well.
James Whitehead, who testified in the Temple Lot case and other places that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist, and he says William Clayton was fired and I was Joseph Smith's personal secretary, not William Clayton. He says all of that. He has in William W. Blair, he's one of the apostles and founders of the RLDS Church, and he writes about talking to James Whitehead, And James Whitehead all the while is just railing on how awful Brigham Young is and everything. But at the same time, he's talking about like how the Council of 50 was a real thing, how the temple ordinances, the anointing quorum, and all those things, that was all real. And he also says on there that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy and that Emma put wives under his hand. That he confirms that. And that's before that was before really any of the accounts from Utah had come out either. But James Whitehead, I mean, he says right there that something that's totally contrary to what he's been saying publicly. He admits right there in a record that we have, a record kept by an RLDS person there, saying that that's what happened.
And again, we should reiterate, like, say, although the Community of Christ, which used to be known as the RLDS
Yeah.
since 2001,
Yeah.
And now basically accept, yeah, Joseph was a polygamist, although many bulk at the idea was a revelation. One
Yeah.
of the core tenets of the founding of the RLDS Church was Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. That came about with
Right.
Brigham Young. There was no Section 132 is not a true revelation, and
Yeah.
they basically built their reputation and the core of their theology and claims to authority based on this, among other things as well. So
Yeah.
this isn't like, say, an adiaphora. This was like a central core tenet of their claims to be the true
This
restorationist group.
this is like this is like this would be like if Heber C. Kimball or George A. Smith wrote in something, went on the record saying that um saying on the record that like Sidney Rigdon was supposed to be the next president of the church. Joseph Smith said that. And said if anything happens to me immediately, it should be Hyman. If it's not Hyman, it should be Sidney Rigdon. This is like the equivalent of that.
Yeah, you would not expect it, especially in a private setting, let alone a
Yeah.
public setting. Unless,
Yeah.
of course, they actually did believe it was true.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you can imagine like the minutes of the Quorum of the 12, like saying something like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
let's
that'd be
get the
huge.
conspiracy to make sure Cindy, who's crazy, doesn't actually become president. Let's fudge things on a global level and say it was Brigham. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, yeah. So you do have a lot of that. And so how these things converge, right? I mean, how you have, it's one thing. I use the example of Louisa Beaman in there too about all the sources surrounding her. It's like she's she's listed named as wife by John Bennett in October 1842 in print. Oliver Onley has it on his private list that's part of his private papers. Um, we Brigham Young refers to her as Louisa Smith in his journal. And but not only that, not only you see that's these things are not just like testimonial witness statements, like somebody said this happened. We know that she does enter into plural marriage early on too. That she does marry Brigham Young as a plural wife, and she does get sealed to Joseph Smith in the temple when they did the proxy sealings and the temple's operational. And then of course, and then she dies in 1850. But then, like for decades, Joseph Bates Noble, who performed the ceremony, which John Bennett pointed out back in 1842, he gives testimonial statements about it many times throughout the rest of his life, up through the 1890s. So, like, what happened there? Did if it's a made up story, who made it up, and when, and why? I mean, Brigham Young does. I mean, you could go through these things individually. You could say, well, John Bennett's not a credible guy, and so we're just going to toss that out. You could say, well, Joseph Bates Noble, he's a Utah Mormon, so he's going to defend his church. You could say Brigham Young recruited Louis B. But like, where did it all happen? So did Brigham Young decide in 1842 that Louisa Beaman was going to be one of Joseph Smith's wives, and so he somehow leaks that information to John Bennett, who's not his friend at all, and John Bennett goes along with this? Yeah. And then Louisa Beaman and Joseph Bates Noble just go, like, they're able to recruit. He's able to recruit them to this conspiracy. I mean, the more and more you get down into the conspiracy, the more and more implausible it is.
Yeah, it really does strain credulity because it's
Yeah.
not simply like, say, you only rely on John Bennett and there's no other evidence. It's like, don't get me wrong, Bennett was often full of crap, but it does seem like, say, no, some of Bennett's claims are actually corroborated by external evidence who are, from Bennett's perspective, hostile witnesses as well.
Yeah.
They, as you know, like, they have no reason to collaborate with Bennett because they don't like one another,
Right. And Bennett has no reason not to expose Brigham Young as being, and that's the other thing is it's a conspiracy. It's one of the best kept pulled off one ever. I mean,
Because no one really benefits from this.
well,
Well, at least
I
Bennett
mean,
wouldn't, you know.
yeah, I mean, and Brigham Young has so many dissenters and people that leave too. I mean, the type of stuff to do. I mean, you'd have to the amount of collusion that would have to do to orchestrate documents. That I mean, just to plan out these details, like who's Joseph's wives and what are these dates and what's the story or where did the revelation come from? And then nobody and Joseph Brigham Young has several people that leave from his inner circle,
Yeah,
and
this
no
is
one
why
ever
like,
exposes this.
and this is why I often, and hopefully I won't annoy you or anyone. It's like I often compared, like, say, people who deny the moon landing. You know, it's like,
Yeah,
could the U.S. government lie to you? I'm a libertarian. I don't like governments, sure, but there's so many clogs in the wheel, if you will, where
yeah,
it's credulity to the nth degree to claim it was an inside job. You know,
yeah.
and it's, again, not to offend people who struggle with polygamy, but like it does seem like, say, to be the 9/11 or moon landing conspiracy theory of Mormon history, if you will. It's like, could Brigham Young dissemble? Sure, I believe he did at times, like when it comes to the Mormon battalion, but there were so many clogs in the wheel, especially from people who would have benefited
Yeah,
to out Brigham as the fraud or the
yeah.
opportunist, but they don't. They actually double down and agree with him as much as they don't like Brigham on a personal or ecclesiastical level.
Yeah, and they'll say other things about him. They'll do other things, but not that.
But it would have benefited
And
him if that was the case, though.
yeah, yeah. So it's just, I mean, there's all kinds of people that are involved there from the beginning, and so it's just, I mean, I really, again, it goes back to I think it has to do with as much as people's mentality and how they see reality as much as it does anything else. I mean, that's, there's just there's a few points and you know, and that's the thing is that they make good points, right? I mean, they do make points individually. They do ask good questions, and there are things that I look at and I say, I can see why somebody would see this particular point and find that compelling. And I think that that does warrant investigation and warrants an answer. But putting it all together and how that all works is where I just don't see how it could be that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist and that it came about by this other conspiracy. I just don't see how it's plausible.
Yeah. Well, we're near, like, say, the 90 minutes. So, like, before
Okay.
we end, again, like, really do appreciate you coming on. As I said, I link the Amazon listen to the print version. You can also get a Kindle to the book, The Secret Covenants, edited by Cheryl Bruno, who, by the way, has a biography on William Marks that came out as well,
Yeah.
because he came up a bit. Again, Mark's essays, Old Women's Tales versus the Historical Verification of Joseph Smith's Polygamy.
Yeah.
But, if someone wanted to delve more on, like, say, maybe this topic, or, like, say, Joseph's polygamy in general, or anything like that, of course, there's Brian Hills's work. He's Mormon Polygamy
Yeah.
Documents website. Our mutual friend Jacob Vidrine himself has one Eternal Round essay, which I think
Yeah.
he makes available on his website for free, where he kind of discusses a lot of the
Yeah.
historical evidence as well. And also Brian Hales, in his response to Denver Snuffer, an interpreter, a journal of Mormon history from a few years ago, discusses the evidence of Joseph's being a polygamist as well. But
Yeah.
and do you know any other sources you'd actually would
So
suggest,
so
or
sources
on your?
on on polygamy denial in or polygamy skepticism or these things or just polygamy in general?
Oh, both. Whichever ones you
Both.
would actually
Okay, yeah.
recommend.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, there's Brian Hales. Typically what I like to do is I like to read one source that leans critical and read one source that serves maybe faithful. And so I think Brian Hales is a verse, and then weigh that against George D. Smith's
Oh,
his Nauvoo polygamy.
Nauvoo polygamy would call it celestial marriage. Is
Yeah,
that the
so
one?
I mean,
Yeah.
put those both together. If you really want a good one that I think goes over it and looks at it from a contemporary deal, just um, the book of A Mormon Enigma about the biography of Emma House Smith actually still holds up pretty well. And yeah, and they did a really good job with that, um, going through and putting it into a chronological way, and they do a good job of pulling from um, non like Utah LDS sources and comparing that against a lot of the sources that were in the Community of Christ RLDS archives. They did a really good job of that, and I would I'd recommend that one. That's pretty darn good. Um, a good book that I don't think really gets enough credit um, is there's a Marina Smith's Revelation Resistance Polygamy. I think it came out about the same time Brian Hales's did, and so it kind of got overshadowed. But what she does a really good job is going over how how Joseph Smith and the church members integrated plural marriage into their life in Nauvoo, what they were doing to keep it a secret, and and just like how they expected it to expand, and how they were figuring out a way. I think I think that dovetails into this topic really quite well. As far as other resources, there's when it comes to these things, we talked here and in the paper, it talks about the like the core arguments about uh, about about how we know Joseph Smith was a polygamist and that it wasn't all made up. But we there's a lot of these very specific things that people brought up about how do we know that this X document isn't fake, or about this. And there's not really a lot of resources on that out there. I have some material that I want to get to, and I want to put out some things. For instance, this is a 40-page thing, and one of the great things I liked about this is having Cheryl having to do a chapter really challenged me to condense what is a really big topic into just some core things, which I thought is actually really helpful. But I mean, there's still some things like I don't know that the apostles weren't experimenting with polygamy back in their mission in England in 1840 and 1841. How do we? I've done work on that, but I haven't put it out in the chapter. And there's a lot of those sorts of things I'd like to get to and put out eventually. But yeah, there's still quite a lot of work to be done if we really wanting to do responding to that. One thing that responding to a lot of specific things, it's not a channel I normally recommend, but there's a Dan Vogel did like an extensive like 3-part response with Bill Reel to Bill Reel had on Clark Abood, and he did a really extensive this stuff about very specific things um, about Joseph Smith and polygamy and about the martyrdom, where Clark had pointed out things, and it's a lot of those are his arguments. A lot of those are the same arguments that other people have pointed out as well too. And you have Dan Vogel, who really knows his stuff as far as documents and stuff really well. Sort of point per point responded to it. And if you really want to be thorough, that's he does a pretty good thing there. I mean, I think that's probably the only other things out there. Again, that's not a channel I normally recommend source there, but I thought Bill Reel and Dan Vogel did a pretty good
Yeah, and it's like as
job
much
on
as
that particular.
yeah, and it's like as much as I disagree with Dan Vogel when it comes to like some of his approaches to like Latter-day Saint scripture and history, he's done phenomenal work for the 5-volume Early Mormon document series, and like he does a very good job on that. He's also done like a very good series, like responding to like a really stupid book on Book of Mormon origins on his YouTube channel as well, where
Yeah,
he absolutely eviscerates it. So you know,
he's a guy that has his own well informed opinions about stuff.
yeah.
As much as
It's
you might
like I
disagree with
disagree with
him.
him, but like he can actually do a very good job at times. It's like I think some of this stuff he's like amongst his best work, as well as the criticisms he has of the Spalding theories
And
of
he's
Book of Mormon
especially good at
origins.
documentary work.
Yeah, I agree.
Documents and documents. He's phenomenal with that.
He's an excellent documents hound. I will have to admit that. My
Oh yeah,
disagreements with
even
him
Joe Smith
notwithstanding.
papers, you know, quotes him and stuff like that on
Yeah.
that. So yeah, yeah,
Okay, well that's excellent. Like as I said, like we're coming to the end of this, but like hopefully for people who have like been found this interesting, definitely do check out the book. It has Mark's excellent essay, but also has some excellent essays by Christopher
yeah.
Smith, Don
A lot of good
Brandy, and
stuff in there.
others as
Yeah,
well. So again, I'm skeptical of like a lot of stuff outside your document stuff published by Signature Books, but this is a book where I have very little hesitancy in like saying, yeah, you should read it.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's like any other history stuff. I mean, there's stuff that I agree with. There's stuff that I don't. But it is all sourced, argued, and documented, and you can read it, find your own, look at the footnotes, make your own opinion about stuff.
yeah. But again, Mark, really do appreciate you coming on, and I do look forward, like say, you doing your forthcoming work on some of the other aspects to dealing with justice polygamy. I know it's not exactly the I can understand, like, say, sometimes you just say, like, why the heck am I doing this? Or, like, maybe we should take a break. But at the same time, like, both yourself, Brian Hales, and Jacob Vadrina and others have done, like, excellent work on this, as well as, like, answering the Joseph Smith monogamist apologists, you know. So, really do appreciate you in terms of your work and also coming on today. And hopefully people will check out your work on this, as well as your debates you did with my friend Jacob Vadrina against the other two apologists for the monogamy theory as well. So again, really do appreciate it, and hopefully we'll have you on in the near future again if and when your other work comes out, if you ever want to come on again.
Sure.
So
right. Thank you.
Oh no, my pleasure, and thanks again for coming on. And for those of you tuning in, hopefully this has been educational. So until then, hopefully we'll have like another podcast episode this month. We will have an Italian member of the church with a background in theology discuss the penal substitution model and why it's stupid. And hopefully we'll have a few other episodes as well in the interim. And by the way, for those who want to join the 2,500 subscriber live stream and dank meme review, tomorrow, let me know. It'll be at 2 p.m. Utah time, 9 p.m. Irish time. So with that as an announcement, thanks for everyone for tuning in. Thank you. Okay, well, that's the end of it. But like, really, again, really do appreciate you coming on. And I do apologize again for like scheduling some